is the outward expression of the true faith values of any people. People that value family life, you'll see it in their advertisements. You'll see it in the music they listen to. You'll see it in their films. These men went off to war to protect women. They were fighting for women. They were fighting for their mothers. They were fighting for their families. They weren't fighting to spread democracy. They weren't fighting for some sort of a global vision of dominion. They weren't fighting for an internationalist agenda. They're fighting simply to preserve the freedoms of their nation and for their mothers, their sweethearts, their homes, and what they understood to be a principle of freedom which was embodied in the Constitution of the United States of America. And for these boys, for the boys of the World War II generation, men were to protect women and children. Men were the defenders of women. They were the defenders of home life. That's part of the philosophy of old Christendom and the pre-modern world.
The boys who fought on Iwo Jima and survived have a unique attachment to that sacred ground. Now in their 80s, warriors of Iwo Jima, their families and descendants gathered at the scene of battle in March 2005 to mark the 60th anniversary. Doug Phillips recognized the historic importance of this reunion. With his two eldest sons, he joined the gathering.
I wanted my sons to be part of history. I wanted them to shake hands with these men. I wanted them to connect with the generations of the past. The Bible says not only to ask your fathers, but ask your elders, and they will tell you. And so this was an elder asking mission for the Phillips family. Some came back in search of answers. They hoped to find a lost burial site of a friend, or maybe to revisit a location that had been important to them 60 years ago. For more than 60 years, Iwo Jima has been an ever-present memory in their life. And coming back to Iwo Jima gave them the opportunity to bring closure. Some came because it was their vision to tell their children. We had one man who was a great-grandfather. He came with his great-grandchild, and the two of them walked the beaches of Iwo Jima, climbed Suribachi together, and the grandfather told stories from 60 years ago.
Virtually undisturbed since the war, the battlefield is off limits to Americans, but for one day a year. The family of Corporal Jake Lindsay, killed by a Japanese grenade, came to erect a plaque in his memory reading, "One man's sacrifice instilled courage and character on a family for generations." A commanding general wrote to Jake's mother at the time of his death, "Greater love hath no man than this, said our Savior, that a man lay down his life for his friends, and the soldier who dies to save his brothers and to defend the hearths and altars of his country reaches this highest of all degrees of charity." Colonel John Edward Fondal and his son, Sergeant John Walker Fondal, were separated by less than a few miles on Iwo Jima. Both Marines had orders to attack different beaches. It was 2 weeks before the elder Fondal was able to search through the battle debris to see if his boy, his only son, was still alive. Sergeant Fondal returned to Iwo Jima, recalling this search.
He came looking for me this one day, and I recognized him coming. And he came up to me, and he said, "Do you know a Sergeant Fondal?" And I said, "Sure do." And he said, "Will you take me to him?" And then I realized that he didn't really recognize me. Of course, we were in helmets. So we had a nice visit for about 2 hours. In fact, we watched the sun go down.
Later, Colonel Fondal gave his son a letter to be read upon his father's death.
He seemed to be apologetic for not being a better father which wasn't true at all.
I spoke to dozens of these men, and I spoke to them before, during, and after the trip to Iwo Jima. This was an incredibly emotional experience. Many a man shed many a tear. It was an emotional experience looking at the island from the airplane, circling the island of Iwo Jima and seeing it for the first time in 60 years. You could see the emotions welling up in the hearts of these men. This was the nightmare of their youth. It was an epic battle in the history of America, but for them, it was a personal, deeply personal moment. But they were going back to the place where they saw sometimes their brothers blown to bits. Perhaps more than any battle in the Pacific, maybe more than any battle of the Second World War, the battle for Iwo Jima sets the stage for teaching the great lessons of the era. On Iwo Jima, manhood perished not. The Battle of Iwo Jima uniquely modeled the very best qualities of biblical manhood: courage, valor, honor, integrity, perseverance against impossible odds. Uncommon valor, Admiral Nimitz tells us, was a common virtue in the Battle of Iwo Jima. These men were up against simply impossible circumstances, and yet they persevered. They fought on until they ultimately achieved the victory.
What I'm feeling right now, traveling with these giants, is a great burden to know that they're passing away and the baton is being passed to us. And we have big shoes to fill. I'm also feeling incredible gratitude to what they did for us, and to know that they may not have seen it at that time, but generations in the future will reap incredible rewards from what they gave us. I'm going to Iwo Jima so that I can honor the sacrifices that my grandfather made and so many other grandfathers made. And I'm going also for my son, the great-grandson, who's just 7 years old, because I want him to see what has been invested in his life and give context to his life and vision to his life, to see that he's not some maverick molecule in the universe running around, but he is connected to a legacy, and a legacy that he can look at and touch and speak to and listen to.
Doug Phillips has a name for the younger men who traveled so far to remember the heroes of this fierce battle. He calls them the League of Grateful Sons.
I brought my sons because I wanted them to honor the men that died. I wanted them to learn from the fathers who are still alive. Even though they have no grandfather or great-grandfather that fought on Iwo Jima, they are the recipients of blessing of the men who did just that. I wanted them to listen to those men. I wanted them to interview those men. I wanted them to talk to those men. I wanted them to say thank you to those men. I wanted them to learn everything we could learn from what God had taught these men and how God had spared these men, because I want my sons to do something important with their lives. I want them to be warriors for God. I want them to love this country. I want them to fight for truth, and I want them to be men. And so it was important to me that they spent a week talking with men who lived at a time when men defend their homes, when men, not women, fight in foreign battlefields, and when our Christian nation, the United States of America, was willing to put everything on the line to defend our families and our households. My mission as a father is to raise my sons to be warriors, and I wanted them to touch the past, to shake hands with the generation that came before them. And I wanted them to be able to internalize and to relate on a deeply personal level to the sacrifice of this remarkable generation where men gave everything to preserve freedoms for a posterity which was yet to be born.
Johnny Boy Butler knew very well why his father fought and gave his life. Johnny Boy grew up to become a Marine officer like his father before him. For more than a half a century, he has made it his goal to study and remember the words and example of a father who faithfully discharged his duties and preserved traditions like women and children first. Joined by his younger brother Clinton, The two sons returned to Iwo on the 60th anniversary to remember a father they knew best through his legacy of letters.
I think just by going there, we're honoring the service, and we're sharing this with the guys that went with him, and being with these guys, is, you know, meeting these men that
I think meeting men who served on the island, people he served with, people like him, you know, is rewarding. It's feeling a piece of him, and also for me, because I haven't been to Iwo, is to go to this battlefield and walk where he walked, and smell it, taste it, feel it, and it's going to have impact.
The American legacy has always been a legacy of gratitude. Now, this is a biblical legacy. The Bible says over and over again, be thankful, be grateful, remember, give thanks for. And so the very principle of the fifth commandment of honoring our father and mother is not only one of having deep inner reverence and appreciation, but gratitude and thankfulness for the fathers that came before us. The fifth commandment is really a generational commandment. In fact, when the Bible speaks of fathers in the scriptures, it's normally referring to grandfathers and great-grandfathers, because the expression fathers means generational fatherhood, oftentimes in the Bible. So remember your fathers means remember all those fathers that were godly fathers that came before you. Even remember the ungodly fathers and learn from their example. Follow the good examples, disregard the bad examples, but remember, remember, remember. You got to remember.
I remember going to church with my dad in a church in the Dominican Republic. I remember Dad watching him pray. He was praying, you know, and I was looking at him. Dad was praying, and I remember that made an impression as a little boy, you know. So we had very poignant memories, and I've got letters he wrote me. I still have them. I have them in here, copies of letters he wrote me on his way to Iwo Jima.
John Butler's love for his father is simply infectious. John Butler had one of these congenial, warm, commanding personalities that earned him the love of the men that were around him. He was a great soldier. He commanded more than 1,000 men. But the thing that John Butler is remembered for most is being a father. John Butler wrote letters to his son and his wife, and they were personal letters. They were meaningful letters. They were letters in which the heart of a father was poured out to his son. He said to his son, "Son, don't be a bully. Protect the little guy. Son, stand beside your mother. Son, it doesn't matter if other boys don't pray. You need to be praying to the Lord every single day." Now, those words have lived on in the life of his sons. Now his sons are mature men in their 60s, and yet the figure of their father has been an ever-present reminder in their own lives as to the standards they should live by.
His presence has never left us.
For extraordinary heroism on Iwo Jima, John Butler was awarded the Navy Cross. Rear Admiral Davison pinned the medal on Johnny Boy during an official visit with the Butler family. Anticipating the possibility of his own death, Colonel Butler composed one final message to his wife.
Dearest babe, there is so little that can be said in this letter, my darling, when our hearts shall go on talking to each other forever, no matter how silent is my voice. It would be so utterly unreasonable to believe that my departure means separation. Don't mourn, babe. I did not go into battle unprepared for death. It wasn't going to touch me, for sure. Of this I was supremely confident. You cannot imagine my surprise when it finally came. I firmly believed that I was to return to you and our children, but God thought otherwise. And darling, if I loved God less, despite all his kindness to me, I would not have gone unprepared for fear that it could mean separation from you for eternity. Babe, I am leaving you with 4 small children. Some will pity you, but I don't, because I know that you loved me dearly, and these children of ours are the living testimonials of this love. Mary Jo and the boys will do much to keep your heart alive. I have great faith in them, babe, because I have faith in you. It doesn't matter so much whether they be rich or considered brilliant or achieve great worldly fame, but so much more important is that they know, love, and serve God and respect the integral dignity of all men. It is goodbye for a little while only, babe. I always loved you. Yours forever, Johnny.
Leading means getting out in front of the truth. You don't sit back there and say, go take Hill 32, boys. You get out front and say, come on, boys, we're taking Hill 32.
Marine officer Bill Henderson was among the first waves of men to hit the beaches of Iwo Jima on D-Day. He was one of the few Marines who would survive all 36 days of fighting, combat regarded by scholars as some of the most brutal of the war. During that time, Henderson would personally inflict serious casualties on the enemy, watch hundreds of his comrades die, and even hold the hand of his wounded best friend, who had less than 1 minute to live. Henderson and his exhausted men fought on until the island was secured and orders arrived for his evacuation. On the way to their transport, Henderson and his men passed the graveyard of the 5th Division. Before a makeshift sign, they summoned strength they did not have to draw themselves to attention. Henderson reports that it was here he wept for the first time in 36 days. "60 years later, Bill Henderson, known by his close friends as the Colonel, wept again when he returned to the beaches of Iwo Jima with his son and grandsons.
Bill Henderson never imagined himself back on the beaches of Iwo Jima. He certainly didn't desire to go back. He went back for the same reason he went there in the first place. It was his duty. It was his duty to storm the beaches, but now as an 82-year-old man, it's his duty to tell the next generation of what God did 60 years prior. And so here is the great patriarch of the past, the valiant Marine who now can no longer walk to those beaches. Bill Henderson required 4 Marines to physically pick him up and walk him down to the beach and place him on the beach. And there he sits on the same beach where he fought and bled 60 years ago. I will never forget, my sons will never forget, seeing the return of the Colonel. There is Bill Henderson, Marine, 5th Division. Maybe the manliest grandfather I've ever met in my life. And there he is sitting on the beaches of Iwo Jima. And what is he doing? He's talking to his sons and his grandsons. And he's telling them stories they've never heard before.
It was a brilliant defense that General Kuribayashi had designed.
And they are sitting with rapt attention as this great preacher, this patriarch of the past, is pouring out pearls of wisdom and personal anecdotes from an experience which, though rarely mentioned over the course of his life, has been near and dear to him for 60 years.
My outfit is the one that raised the flag. So when I was down here, I was the operation officer. I was watching them through a pair of field glasses, and I was probably about along where this road is over to the right, except I was a little more to the right.
Major Henderson attributes his perseverance under fire to his faith in God and the influence of a loving, manly father.
My main concern going into battle was that I may not perform my duties in an honorable manner. And I was mainly concerned about that because I did not want to disappoint my family, particularly my father. And although he was a minister, he was one of the most manly men I've ever known. He was a real man's man, and he
always, I was very close to him, and he was a very good father, to me. My father was a very courageous man. I never saw him compromise on any belief that he had. I remember that was, of course, and also that I would never do anything to disappoint my father. I remember that was always on my mind. I could remember one particular occasion. Back then we had to climb a cargo net at Quantico with a 75-pound pack on our back, and the cargo net was not secure at the bottom. So it would go like this. And I mean, I never had a whole lot of upper body strength. And I got about 3/4 of the way up there, and I could not make it. A lot of men stronger than me had already fallen off. But I remembered, I said, I cannot let my dad down. And before I knew it, I was at the top.
At age 82, Major Henderson explains why he has dedicated the remainder of his life to proclaiming the faithfulness of God to the next generation.
I mean, I was certainly not interested in making this trip for 3 reasons. First of all, it is very painful to recall some of the experiences. Secondly, it is too tender to recall, And thirdly, by recounting my experience, it may appear that I am something other than what I am. Well, I believe when I became a true believer that God's purpose is at work in my life. He has a plan for me, and I believe that ultimate plan will not be frustrated. Well, I think the Word says that we eat grapes from vineyards we did not plant, and I am enjoying a freedom that I did not earn. I owe it to past generations, all the way from Bunker Hill, to Iwo Jima. I owe it to those men for the freedom that I now enjoy, and it's very important that I pass that along to them. There was a debt that I could not pay, that I could certainly try to pay my portion of it by serving this country and the interest of the people of this country. We were taught, in our history books back then, which was a long time ago, we were taught, the faith of our fathers.
3 years ago, I sat with Colonel Henderson, and after reading Psalm 78, and after sharing with his family and with others, and after being impacted by what the Word of God said to grandfathers, he turned to me and he said, I now know what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life. I'm supposed to tell my children and my grandchildren, this is my mission.
So I realize a responsibility that I have, to not only my grandchildren, but everybody that I, have any effect whatsoever on. I pray every day that whatever I do, whoever I touch, that somehow that'll have a positive effect on them, that something of God will show through, through that. I accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior at 5 years of age. In 77 years, I have found Him to be faithful in everything that I've practiced in my life. Through the pain and the torture, whatever it may have been, through the fear of life, through the fear of death, all of those sort of things, He has always been faithful. So it's that kind of thing that I can relate to my grandchildren and others. The fact is that He is, and we will be faithful. They used to call, back then William used to be, a lot of times they'd call him Billy. So they said, what do you think about Billy? My father recounted this. Said, oh, I never worry about Billy. He'll make out. He'll make out, with it. And of course, my friend told me that. Well, that of course served as a toxin for me to all this, which I don't know how many times that came up in my mind when I faced things along in life that were very difficult, that I wanted to give up, that I wanted to quit, but that thought just reverberated in my mind, and I couldn't give up, and it has been a great blessing to me over the years. What was it? Esther's uncle said to her, God, you were born for such a time as this. I think, we were born for maybe this. I hope this is it, because I hope that my life has been such that we can recount it in such a way that it will be meaningful, because I'm afraid I haven't done much other that would be very meaningful. Made a little money, I did this or that and the other, but that's not very important. In the end is just what My grandchildren have learned, my son learned it, my grandsons have learned. That's the only inheritance I'm going to leave that's worth anything.
Bill Brown's romance with flying began when he was 5 years old, the year Lindbergh flew the Atlantic. One day, a daredevil aviator buzzed his family's chicken farm. William's mother waved down the barnstormer and traded a home-cooked chicken dinner for her son's first plane ride. A few years later, Bill was spending afternoons in the home of neighbor and aviation pioneer Jimmy Doolittle, who became the hero of the daring bombing raid over Tokyo. At 17, Bill Brown enlisted. After just 10 hours of instruction, he was flying fighter planes. Second Lieutenant William Brown was one of the P-51 Mustang pilots ordered to Iwo Jima to fly escort missions off the volcano island. Brown's grateful son, Scott, was another of the men who fulfilled a lifelong ambition to journey to Iwo Jima to honor his father.
I love that island. I don't know how to explain this, but when I looked on that island, when the plane banked around it and pulled all the way around it, 360 degrees, the most prominent thought in my mind was, this is a beautiful island. I love this island. And why do I love this island? I love this island because it's part of my heritage. And because it's part of my father's life, it's part of my life. And it helps me know where I am in history. There's something in every son I've ever known that he wants to walk in his father's footsteps. And I was looking around that mountain, and I could see so many sons that were there to honor their fathers. Some of their fathers had died a couple of years ago. Some of them died on the island. But there were lots and lots of sons there that wanted to walk in the exact footsteps of their father. And I thought that was so interesting because I want to do that. Every son there wanted to find the place that their father fell, or the place where their father was when the flag went up, or the place where he was shot, or the place where, something happened that was so meaningful to the father. The son wanted to be there. And so you'd see these guys, they were covered with dirt, they were crawling through caves, they were whacking through the brush, they had to get there. And that's what they did. And I realized that that's why I was there. I wanted to walk in my father's footsteps. I wanted to be where he was. I wanted to see the things that he saw. I wanted to walk in the footsteps of my father. And I think that that's something that's in the heart of every boy. God places it there. And until a boy actually begins to walk in the footsteps of his father and to honor his father, he can never really be a man.
Scott Brown's father flew his last mission off the island of Iwo Jima. He was shot down near Tokyo Bay. His parents were notified of his death, but 3 weeks later received a message from Bill saying he was alive, providentially rescued by an American submarine.
The doctrine of providence teaches us that there is not an event, not an activity, not an individual that is not under the direct oversight of the Lord Jesus Christ himself, of the God of the Scriptures. God providentially preserves, protects, and directs the courses of nation. And God commands that children seek out to understand the providences of God. Now, the men of the World War II generation were unique providential vehicles in the preservation of freedom for this nation. God raised up a generation of boys, and by and large, we're talking about boys between the age of 18 and 24 that went off and were placed in unspeakably difficult circumstances, unspeakably difficult, many of which would be hard to imagine in our present day and age, circumstances that probably will never be repeated again. Men, 100,000 of them, fighting on a black rock in the middle of the Pacific simply to get access to airfields. God providentially brought about a victory there, and he providentially decreed that some would live and some would die. We must see the providences of God and be grateful for them. This generation owes everything to the fact that there were others that came before us that were the providential vehicles of God in preserving and securing the liberty for the present. Bill Brown was there at Iwo Jima, but he lived. He survived. But the gift of life that was given to him, he then invested. He took this gift and he invested it in his children through storytelling, letter writing, book writing, remembrances, passing on the legacy of what happened on Iwo Jima to his grandchildren to this very day.
My father has been not only speaking of the providences of God in his life and writing about the providences of God in his life in the last 15 years, maybe 20 years he's been doing this. But every man his age he can get a hold of, he is encouraging to do the exact same thing.
And one of the strange things, seeing all these old guys, these fellows who, 86 or 87 fellows who had been there. We had all aged a little bit. And it was interesting to be reminded that that's what history is all about. It's talking about, telling about, which my generation didn't do for 50 years. None of them began to talk about what had happened. And now a lot of them have spoken up and connected with their children and grandchildren. And that connection means real history is being transferred to the younger generation.
It's so important that we go to our fathers before they're gone, because we are guaranteed, it is a biblical prophecy that nations that do not remember the providence of God and their fathers will be relegated to the dust heap of history. There will be no America unless we honor our fathers. There will be no America unless we honor our fathers. And we can only honor our fathers if we go to them while there's time, if we archive their stories, if we reflect on what they've done, if we give thanks for the providence of God working through these imperfect men, and if we see the blessings that have been bequeathed to us through them for this generation.
Why is Iwo Jima important for the Brown family? Well, it's part of the story of God's grace on our families. And all of my children have a better understanding of their place in history because we understand this battle more clearly. They understand what led up to World War II. They understand more about the Depression. They understand more about Japanese expansionism. They understand more about Adolf Hitler. They understand what was going on and what my family was experiencing during that time. So this understanding of Iwo Jima gives us a broader sense of who we are, what our place is in history. Why did God preserve the life of my father? Why are we here even talking about it? Well, our family has a responsibility to communicate the goodness and the grace of God to everyone that comes across our pathway. I believe that's why God preserved my father's life. The things that I'm doing today are a direct result of God's kind providence toward my father in preserving his life. So we're a thankful family, but this helps us to see where we fit and what lengths God went to preserve our family heritage. So I want my children and my grandchildren to understand that God was merciful to the Brown family to give them more years of life together. And so we want to use those years faithfully before God. We don't want to squander those years. We don't want to lose the trust that God has given us to communicate His goodness to the next generation.
When fathers fail to train, to teach, and to speak to the next generation, the inevitable result are an entire generation of young men and young women who are without rudder, without context, without meaning, and without hope. They're looking to try to understand who they are. And since they're not getting the answers from their fathers, they're looking to the worst elements of society to try to fill the void which they feel in their heart. And so the surest way to destroy, to wipe out a generation is for fathers not to speak to their children, for fathers not to open the testimonies of the providences of God to the next generation. I fear that this generation is a generation in which there's a fundamental disconnect between fathers and sons. Unfortunately, for some of the men of the Iwo Jima generation, while their fathers invested in their lives, these men had a difficult time processing how do we then take these phenomenally difficult experiences and then transmit them to our children with meaning and with hope. Many of them had a great challenge with that. I'm so thankful that now in the twilight of their lives, the episodes of their early youth, now filtered through the lens, we hope, of a providential view of history, these are once again surfacing, and the men are taking seriously their duty to talk to their sons and their daughters.
That's why dads need to tell the stories. My dad did that. So I learned a lot about how to handle the things that were going down in my life, because I saw my dad dealing with things that were difficult. So there was a big investment in time to tell that story and all the other stories that they've been telling. And fathers need to take the time, and my dad did that, and I'm so thankful that he did.
Bill Brown did his duty on Iwo Jima, but more important than that, for 60 years he did his duty as a father. He encouraged his son to inquire. He spoke to his son of the great deeds of God. He freely gave lessons that he learned from his time on Iwo Jima, and just as a man, as a pilot, his experiences in the Second World War. And now there are 3 generations of Browns that are delighting in the very same things. There's the fighter pilot, the son of the fighter pilot, and the granddaughter of the fighter pilot who's made it her life mission to record and recollect the great deeds of God in her grandfather's life.
He doesn't think of himself as a hero, just a boy who went off and he was given his orders, he did what he was told, and he came home, and that's it. He would never have us think of him as being some big shot or anything like that. And my grandfather would probably never tell you that he was shot down over Tokyo Bay during a raid, that he was shot in the neck and because of it awarded the Purple Heart. He would just as soon forget the whole story, I think. And I think it's because he feels like when he compares something so small to all the others who experience something so much bigger, he just doesn't feel that it would be right for him to draw attention to himself in that way. The way that he thinks about the war, about his war experience, the way he thinks about the providence of God through all of it, the way everything that he tells me regarding his experiences there is all filtered through this biblical grid. That's what makes him a hero to me, I think. It takes faith in God to go through what those men went through, and then to come home with the mindset of having a spirit of peace and the ability to look on your enemy and say, we must forgive. And it takes a strength that only God can give to experience the horror of the things that those men experienced, and then to come home and be able to look back on what you experienced and say, Lord, even in the midst of the most wicked and sinful things, you're still in control. And a man who can live that way, a man who can say that and live that, that's a hero.
Honoring my father allows me to see the providences of God in history. God always glorifies himself through history. Now, we won't always understand how he is bringing glory to himself, but one day we will know. But all of these things happened on Iwo Jima so that God would be glorified. And so I want to go back to Iwo Jima, and I want to take note of the providences of God, the mighty hand of God to preserve life, the mighty hand of God to place things in men's hearts, to do wondrous things for their comrades. All of history points to the ever-kind providence of God. So, you know, all of these stories from Iwo Jima are a finger pointing to the goodness of God. They all point to how God uses terrible experiences to bring about good. All things work together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. And I want to squeeze as much good out of the horrors of Iwo Jima as I can.
As I stood down by the water and thought of all the different men that died there, I was reminded of the reason that my grandfather decided that he needed to come back to Iwo Jima. And it was not for personal reasons. It was not because it would bring him pleasure in any way. It was because of me and my two sisters and my brother, and the idea of passing on the story of God's faithfulness in his life, and then providentially in his son's life, and now in our lives. So he was doing it because he wanted to paint a clear picture for us of our heritage and the ways that God had protected him.
Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, which moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven.
From the top of Mount Suribachi, Bill Brown read to his family from the same Bible he had read in his foxhole.
Standing on the top of Mount Suribachi, I was able to see every single geographical location my father told me about all my life. He would point to one, he would point to another, he would point to another, he would point to his foxhole, he would point to his airfield, he would point to the place where there was a massive raid, some of his buddies were killed. He'd point to his tent where one day he was the only one alive in his tent, everybody had been killed. And so I was able to see with my own eyes all the things that he told me about. It was joy to me. I was so happy on that island. I know for so many of the men, it was a very tender time. It was a very emotional time, and there was grieving that went on. I didn't grieve at all. I was happy because I was able to see the things that my father told me about. My father is telling his story so that the goodness of God would be known in future generations.